Hi, I'm George Chalefsky, and I'm a research scientist at IBM T.J. Watson Research Center. Today, I've been challenged to teach one concept in 5 levels of increasing complexity. And my topic is nanotechnology. Nanotechnology is the study of objects in the nanoscale, between 1 and 100 nanometers in size. And it turns out that objects in this size scale have really interesting properties that differ from objects at a macroscopic scale. Our task as nanotechnologists is to understand these materials, understand their properties, and then try to build new technologies based on these properties. At the end of the day, my hope is that you'll understand nanotechnology at some level. Hi, are you Bella?
Yes.
Bella, I'm George. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
I'm a research scientist. Do you like science?
Yeah.
I wanted to talk to you about a specific type of science called nanotechnology. Have you ever heard of this word before? Nano's kind of a funny word, right? It's a word that's used before another word, and it means 1 billion. What's the smallest object you can think of?
A baby ant?
A baby ant? Very good. So I have over here a meter stick. Let me show it to you. And so that's a meter, and if I divide it by 1,000, I get a millimeter. So milli just means 1,000. There's all these little lines on the ruler, and each of those little lines is 1 millimeter. So baby ant is probably a couple of millimeters. So even the thing that's the smallest thing you can think of, it's 1,000,000 times bigger than a nanometer. Tiny, tiny, tiny.
Tiny, 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 tiny.
If I took this stick and I was to draw 1 billion lines, the distance between those two lines would be 1 nanometer. So that's really all it is. It's just a measure of size, but it's really, really, really tiny. You know, smaller than anything that we can see with our eyes. The reason why in nanotechnology, in scientists, we care about things that are that small is because there are objects called atoms. So have you ever heard of atoms before?
Yes. I first heard of them on a show I watched called Storybots. They're just little things that make up like everything on Earth, even Earth.
That is a perfect explanation. But what if I told you that scientists invented a special type of microscope that not only lets you see atoms, but also lets you move them around and build things with them? Wouldn't you think that would be pretty cool?
Yeah.
So it's called a scanning tunneling microscope. And not only can you see the atoms, but you can move them around. Atoms are kind of sticky. You can actually build things using this instrument with actual individual atoms. So if I gave you that machine, would you want to make something? Would you want to look at something very carefully?
I would want to make a unicorn out of the atoms.
You are definitely a second grader. My daughter would probably answer the exact same way. A unicorn would be awesome.
Why do you study stuff so small?
I study it because objects that are that small have really interesting properties. They behave completely different than objects that are big. And because of that, we can build really cool things with them, like really fast computers, for example, or new types of batteries, or new types of solar cells. And a lot of nanotechnology is kind of like playing with Legos. You take these small objects and you put them together to build something new, something interesting that no one's built before. It's like Legos for scientists.
Cool.
So how old are you?
I'm 16.
16. So what is that, you're in 10th grade?
Junior year, so 11th grade.
So have you heard of nanotechnology? Have you heard of this term before?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
What do you think of when you think of nanotechnology?
It kind of seems very science fiction.
You know, you're right. When you read about some of these technologies, it does feel like science fiction. But the part of nanotechnology I wanted to talk to you about is stuff that you probably use every day, most of your day, all of the time. Can you guess what aspect of nanotechnology I'm going to talk to you about?
My phone?
Yeah, so modern computer chips rely heavily on nanotechnology. Does this look familiar to you? Can you guess what this might be?
I don't know.
So this is a silicon wafer, and they're embedded in basically almost every object that you use, from a laptop to a phone to cars, television sets, appliances. We end up cutting these into little squares. And those repeating patterns, each of those is a processor. And those chips are what goes into all of these objects. What I want to talk to you about is how we got from kind of where we started and how we're able to actually fit 18 billion of these little devices in a little, 1 inch by 1 inch area. They're called transistors. It's a switch, very simply. Think of it as a light switch that turns on and turns off using an electric field by applying a voltage. I went through my kids' Lego bins to build a very simple model of a transistor. And these are wired together in circuits so that you can do computation, you can do logic with them. Where nanotechnology comes into play, the way you double the number of transistors on a chip, can you guess what you would have to do to this transistor?
You make it smaller?
You have to make it smaller, exactly. But here's the problem. So about 10 to 15 years ago, the devices got so small that if you shrunk them, this gate that actually turns it on and off loses its ability to control the channel. And so what they did was they took devices like this into these things, we call them FinFETs, kind of like a fin on a fish. So they're very thin transistors. The width of these fins is only 6 nanometers. Okay, so 6 nanometers is 25 to 30 atoms across. And they repeat this over the entire wafer just about perfectly. It's just a huge feat in engineering. But these types of devices are exactly the kind of devices that your phones and computers either have or will have in the near future. And it's a way that nanotechnology is directly impacting you right now.
How do you make stuff that small? Like, obviously, it's not handmade, so is it like factories and stuff?
Exactly. So these are made using a technique called lithography. You basically coat the silicon wafer with a polymer, then you put a mask on it, and then you shine light through it. And the features of the mask, the size of those holes, determine the feature size in the chip. It's not just the size of the mask that matters, it's the wavelength of the light that's used. We talked about nanotechnology being science fiction before, but this is real stuff that's being produced, that's being made, that's being used every day by people.
In middle school, I've built all the little switches where you turn the electricity on and it goes from like one thing to the other. But those are like the really big, like comical, like plugging in like Legos and stuff. When we saw the picture of all of the little ones, like it's like a city. It's crazy how simple and complex it is at the same time.
Exactly. I couldn't put it any better. That's right. So what's your major?
Chemical engineering.
What made you choose that?
Like any freshman going into chemical engineering, I was like, I like chemistry, so I'm gonna go into chemical engineering. But luckily, I also like, all the math and all the science too.
So have you taken a quantum mechanics course?
I have. I took that last year.
I think to really get deep into nanomaterials and nanoscale devices, you really have to understand, to some level, quantum mechanics. What it teaches us as we make these devices smaller and smaller, their properties begin to now depend on the size and the orientation of these devices. There are materials, and you're taking a 2D materials class, you know about this, that are intrinsically thin. Like as they're grown, as they're fabricated, they're already at the nanoscale, and they possess these quantum confinement properties that as a nanotechnologist you try to exploit. And so the first ones I wanted to talk to you about are quantum dots. Have you heard of quantum dots before?
Yes.
So these are typically semiconductors. They can be cadmium selenide, cadmium sulfide, zinc selenide, and they're small clusters of atoms. They can be from 2 to 10 nanometers. What's interesting about these materials?
Well, the other day we were talking about the different dimensions you can have of nanotechnology, so all the way from like 0D to 3D. If I remember correctly, my professor labeled it as 0D.
That's correct, yeah. Because of quantum confinement, once you get below this 15 nanometer range, the band gap of the material depends completely on the size of the material. So in bulk materials, if you want to change the band gap, you have to change the material, right? But in these quantum dots specifically, just by changing the size, you can change their band gap. And because their band gap is changing, their optical properties are different. And you can precisely tune the wavelength of light that they emit just by changing their size.
What are the applications of these quantum dots?
So there are people that are exploring using these materials for diode lasers. There are companies that are building displays from these materials. And there are even people thinking about, if I take these quantum dots and I change the chemistry on the outside so they stick to specific types of cells or tissue, that I could really do some interesting imaging and therapeutic work to track disease, even maybe to treat disease, if you can very precisely control the chemistry.
How far away is this from being actually used on an industrial level?
The optical applications are in development. The science has really been worked out. The health stuff, because of all of the things you have to consider when you're putting something in someone's body, is definitely further out there. For example, some of them are made from cadmium. Cadmium's toxic. You would never put that in someone's body. But there are other materials like gold and silver and titanium dioxide, which are less toxic, and people are exploring using those. So have you learned about graphene?
Yeah.
Do you know what this is?
Carbon nanotube?
Carbon nanotube, right. So if you roll up graphene, depending on how you roll it and the angle you roll it with, it has different properties. So if I roll it one way, it'll act like a metal. If I roll it a different way, it'll act like a semiconductor. The one that gets everyone most excited is that the electrons and holes move very fast through graphene. And so there's a lot of interest in using these for certain types of high-speed electronics. The other interesting application is because it's one atom thin, it's very sensitive to changes in the environment, and so there's a lot of interest in using them as diagnostics. It's on us researchers to find ways to A, control that process, and then B, to actually build some sort of interesting technology from them.
So you've been talking about the different ways you can, say, roll these nanotubes. So how do you go about building and controlling these nanotubes in terms of their diameter?
So you're speaking my language. This is what I spent many years of my life working on. You don't physically roll up graphene. You grow nanotubes by basically taking nanocrystals and you deposit them on a surface, and then you do a CVD process, chemical vapor deposition. So you basically flow in a carbon source. The carbon dissolves in a nanocrystal, and then once the nanocrystal is saturated, the nanotubes precipitate out of them in tubes. Then you have to develop ways to go into this pile of nanotubes and pull out exactly the ones that you want. So I have to find ways to program them to go exactly in the places that I want. I modify the surface of the nanotube with specific molecules that recognize one type of surface over another. And then I just pattern the surface and the tubes just land exactly where we want them to. And it's still very much in the research stage. The ultimate goal is to build functional high-speed electronics using these new materials.
In my nanomaterials class, actually, just a couple of days ago, we were talking about different applications of nanotechnology and things we know. And we touched on the topic that right now silicon is kind of down to the smallest level that it can get. And so we have scientists out there researching other materials to replace silicon.
Yeah, 100%, that's right. And that's the motivation for looking at these emerging materials. But I would never bet against the innovation and the creativity in this nanoelectronic space. Tens of thousands of scientists, every time they hit a barrier, at least historically as a guide, they have found a way to overcome it. I mean, it's a real marvel in ingenuity.
So I gotta ask, the lights that are behind you, is that related to the quantum dots that you work with at all?
It's just pretty lights. But now that you suggested it, these were inspired by the array of quantum dots that we showed earlier. So that's the story I'm going to stick with. I like it.
Well, thank you so much. This was all so very interesting.
So you're a graduate student, and so tell me a bit about your work.
I've been working on energy storage materials, and the most popular are batteries that we work on. A lot of the revolution that's come in electronics is kind of our model to try and use some nanoscale advances and put them in to batteries.
What is it about nanomaterials, that scale, and the properties of these materials that make them uniquely promising to incorporate into battery technology?
So for batteries, one of the main constraints when we're designing batteries is trying to maintain or reduce the volume and mass of the components. And nanomaterials are particularly well suited to adding functionality while having this negligible increase in volume. And so we get a huge benefit from using nanomaterials without sacrificing the volume of the battery.
What is it exactly that you're trying to tease out of these materials to improve the battery's performance?
At first, one of the main things that we did was use nanomaterials to add conductivity. And so carbon nanotubes and graphene are really good at adding conductivity to batteries. And then in the subsequent years, nanomaterials have been really interesting from things like incorporating sensors into batteries, so increasing the functionality of batteries, having some responsive materials that use things like graphene sheets that are incorporated into a matrix, and then you add a safety functionality to a battery. We're trying to squeeze out almost all the functionality that we can. And as new nanomaterials are being discovered and their new properties being discovered, a lot of the time that someone tries to think of a way to translate that into a battery.
Because the materials are so small, they're at the nanoscale, their properties are dominated by quantum mechanics, which means that even slight changes in their size, in their orientation, give profound changes in their properties. And while that's very scientifically interesting and it allows you to tune their properties by making subtle changes, from a technology point of view, it's a bit of a headache in the sense that in technology we want to optimize for a property and then repeat that over and over again. So what are some of the challenges that you face in the lab related to working with these materials and in trying to incorporate them into the batteries?
I think every step of a process in a battery is kind of something where you have to think about how would this translate to making a battery in terms of the production. One thing that I think is very interesting about the field of nanoscale materials in general is that how you make the material changes the properties a lot. And so if we claim that this 2D material has this property, then tying that to the battery performance is something that's pretty difficult to do. It takes a few steps in between. So we have to think kind of creatively with how we can do that.
That's actually, I think, a very common problem. We can build a device in the lab. It could be a transistor, it can be a battery. And then you ask the question, okay, so what's the next step? How do we take it from that lab demonstration into a technology? The kind of work that I'm very interested in is developing tools to make the exact type of materials that you want. The tools that we used in the past for conventional fabrication just don't work with these materials because they're all grown from the bottom up. They're intrinsically small, and you have to find ways to either use chemistry or some other means to get them to assemble into the structures that you want, to actually either grow specifically what you want, or after you grow them to pull out the ones that you want. You need to be able to build that same thing over and over again with the exact same properties. No one institution, no one research lab, no one national lab is going to solve all of these problems on their own because they are difficult problems, and there is a real important payoff at the end, and it's going to take all of us making our contributions to push this field forward. I remember reading your papers when I was a student, and we're all trying to create these materials and finding ways to exploit their properties. What I love, and I'm delighted that you're here to talk to us about, is how you took inspiration from nature and sort of recognized that nature's figured out a way to both synthesize incredibly complex nanostructures with high functionality, and how you sort of were inspired by that to do the research that you're doing now.
Life gave us this toolkit that is already on the nanoscale, so we think that that's a great place to think about making materials on the nanoscale and manipulating materials on the nanoscale, and actually in wiring them together as well. This abalone shell, you can see the exquisite, beautiful colors and structures of it. This is a nanocomposite material. If you take this and fracture it and you look at it in a scanning electron microscope, what you'll see is that it's made out of these beautiful tablets. And I studied that as a graduate student. I looked at that and I said, that is completely amazing. You have an organism in the ocean that takes what's in its environment, which is calcium and carbonate that's dissolved in the water, and templates it into this really exquisite structure. And so you think that's great, calcium carbonate is great, but what if we wanted to make a solar cell or another electronic device or a battery? How would you get an organism to do that? And you say, okay, that's a really crazy idea, but is it really that crazy if this abalone, already figured out how to do it, 500 million years ago? So we're saying, okay, abalones build shells. Can viruses build solar cells? Can viruses build catalysts? Can they build batteries using the same kind of idea?
It's really fascinating work, especially now. We're all familiar with viruses and how they act, and I'm not aware of any viruses that build nanostructures. So how did you come to that? And then how do you actually program a virus to do your bidding?
We work on something called bacteriophages. It's a virus with DNA. This particular bacteriophage, called M13 bacteriophage, is made up of single-stranded DNA and proteins. It's long and thin, so it's 880 nanometers in length, and it's about 9 nanometers in diameter. And so one of the reasons I love it is it spans the nanoscale and almost the micron scale at the same time. Take the single-strand DNA, it's obviously a model, and you can cut it with molecular scissors, and you can put a new piece of DNA in between. And so you put a small piece of DNA in there that doesn't belong there. And that piece of DNA is going to randomly code for a protein. Now, the next time that that virus is replicated within a bacterial host, it'll be able to put a new protein sequence on the coat, just a short protein sequence on the coat, maybe like 8 or 12 amino acids in length. And just like that abalone is going to grab calcium and build calcium carbonate, we're going to have our viruses build iron phosphate for a battery electrode material, or gallium arsenide or cad sulfide for a semiconductor material.
So you've evolved and I suppose trained these viruses to build the materials that you want them to build by exposing them to the raw materials and then evolving their function. We're trying to build electronics from nanomaterials. The critical issue that we're facing is how do you go from those single experiments with a single material, understanding its properties, how do you scale that to the billions of devices that you need in a technology? It is a chemistry-driven approach. We're not going to grow them exactly where we want them. But to take that one step and to tie it into what you're doing, it sounds like there could be an area of collaboration where instead of using sort of conventional chemistry, that we can train some of these biological elements to do that work for us.
Biology is chemistry. Molecules, proteins, and DNA work with all the same kinds of bonding and things that the chemicals that you're going to be looking for in these processes. It's put together in a way that when a protein or enzyme folds, it almost always folds correctly. That's kind of the beauty of it, the predictable aspect of it, encoded in its DNA. If we need to make it the same over and over again, then as long as you have the right DNA sequence, DNA is a beautiful structure on the nanoscale. And there's really cool, incredible work on DNA origami, where DNA can fold into just the right structure. And so I can see that as an interface that would be really cool and interesting in your work. And you can have the virus make the DNA for the DNA origami, and then use DNA to assemble your beautiful structures.
It's really fascinating. You have all these little worker viruses building the materials for you. How are you then applying these materials that you're building?
We started thinking about how can we make an impact in cancer. We do it mostly in imaging technologies to look deep inside the body non-invasively with light. And the way that we came about that was through solar cells and batteries. We trained our viruses to pick up carbon nanotubes and hold on to them very, very tightly. And then we'll give a virus a second gene to code for a protein to grow, in the case of a battery electrode material. It allows it to weave together a good electrical conductor and a good ionic conductor at the same time, all within this really, really small space. And the optical properties of these carbon nanotubes are in the wavelength that is interesting for imaging deep inside the body. We started building a bunch of imaging tools that could image above 1,000 nanometers wavelength. And so this is in near IR. And that's a really special window where you have some optical transparency of tissue in the body. The other gene we engineered to find ovarian cancer. We developed imaging tools with Harvard Medical School and MIT Lincoln Labs to find tiny ovarian tumors. It's hard to see things less than a centimeter in size with ovarian cancer, just based on the location in the body. But with our imaging system, we could find tumors that were below a millimeter in size, actually.
Looking ahead, 5 years, 10 years, where do you see your own work and maybe the field more broadly?
The future I'd like to see is environmentally friendly chemistry and materials synthesis. And I think that we're really going that way if we think about batteries of the future, solar cells of the future, thinking about earth-abundant materials and processes that are compatible with the earth and environment.
One of the things that I love about nanoscience is it tends to break up the silos between those traditional scientific disciplines. My training was in chemistry, but I had to very quickly merge chemistry and physics. And now I see an area where chemistry, physics, and biology are coming together to produce new materials and new technology and to advance the field forward. And so being in this field, you kind of have to cross-pollinate, between these different disciplines and kind of advance the field together.
I agree completely. We like to solve problems. Nanobio is the toolkit that we bring a lot. It happens to be a very strong and evolving toolkit. That's another thing that I love about biology is if you can come up with a solution that's not perfect at all to begin with, when you're making a battery electrode material or any kind of material you're making, you have evolution on your side to try to make it better and better as a function of time. That can be quite rapid.
So Angela, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing more work coming out of your lab in the future.
Thanks for having me, George. It was really fun to interact, and I'm very excited about our future collaboration.
Me too, absolutely. I really enjoyed talking to these 5 different people about nanotechnology. Nanotechnology is a field that affects all of us every day as it finds its way into a variety of applications. And I hope you enjoyed it as well and see the impact that nanotechnology has on your life today and how much more of an impact it'll have on all of our lives in the future.